You really need that local understanding and that local knowledge to understand what you're actually seeing and then be able to make decisions based upon what that information is showing you. The only way to do that, again, is with boots on the ground in the local area that has that understanding of the local business norms, cultures, and customs.
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast. This is a 5-part series on geopolitical risk intelligence, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with episode 3 of the 5-part Infortal Worldwide podcast series, Geopolitical Risk Intelligence. Today, I'm thrilled to have back Chris Mason, and we're going to take up corruption intelligence. Chris, first of all, welcome back.
Appreciate it, Tom. Glad to be here again. Looking forward to the conversation today. I know this is one of your areas of expertise, so really looking forward to diving in.
So, Chris, one of the things that the Department of Justice has communicated to us thoroughly since October 2021 is corporate culture and the importance of corporate culture in the DOJ's assessment of a fine and penalty if there's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I wanted to start with asking you sort of a bigger picture question about the corruption and business culture clash and how you would help a compliance officer or even a senior executive begin to think through this issue.
It's so important that the saying that's out there, it's somewhat cliche, but it's so true. And that's culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's so true in effect, in operations. You've really got to set the cultural tone of your company. And it's got to be top down. And so corruption is definitely something that needs to have a top down approach. So you've got to start with setting your company's culture, outlook, and how you plan to approach anti-corruption regulation and making sure that your company is doing the right things. Now, once you've got those cultural norms established, you've got to start thinking about, in practice, how is that culture of compliance going to be maintained? Okay. And one of the areas where we frequently help out customers and clients is when companies are looking to expand their operations abroad. They're looking to go overseas into new jurisdictions. And what you've got in terms of challenges once you start going overseas is you've got very different ways of operating, different ways of doing business, different cultural norms. And it's extremely important for businesses to understand the local business culture in the jurisdictions where they plan on doing business. And without really taking a holistic view of what's going on the ground level, you're not going to truly understand what the business culture is that you're jumping into.
Now let me turn to some recent examples, and I'm going to even expand it a little bit beyond corporations to enforcement actions. One of the, I think, key developments in the international fight against bribery and corruption has been cooperation at the international level, both in investigations and enforcement action. The United States Department of Justice works very closely with foreign government and foreign prosecutorial powers. That could include the United Kingdom, the Serious Fraud Office, France, Germany, Spain. I guess the most is Brazil. And so I was wondering if you could give us some examples that you're aware of where there's been joint investigation and enforcement, literally not across the globe, but across jurisdictions across the globe.
The situation in Brazil is a great example. It shows some real in-depth collaboration across governments between the U.S. federal law enforcement agencies and those that are in Brazil. A couple of years back, the federal government in Brazil really made a commitment to stamping out corruption. And the U.S. has been a big supporter of that, of course. But what you've seen lately is in terms of enforcement actions, and there's been quite a few, even as recent as the last quarter of 2022, where the Brazilian authorities really were taking the lead at the ground level, pulling together the investigation. And they had the full support and backing of U.S. federal law enforcement. And together, they were able to really take it to a new level, bring down some pretty wide and organized webs of corruption. And something that I think to note about the overall collaboration process is if you look at the penalties, when it gets to the penalty phase in the FCPA review process, you're now seeing splits in terms of compensation or penalties being paid to the Brazilian government in the case of Brazil and the US authorities. I think that'll be something to watch as we move forward in 2023 and even beyond, because if you think about it, allowing some of that penalty funding to go to the countries abroad, it really sets a good example for other countries that, hey, it's actually worth our while to set up some of these compliance operations and really work with our partners in terms of generating revenue.
Chris, I'd like to amplify this point a little bit, particularly in terms of operation during an investigation by citing to countries that typically are, if not antithetical to the United States, perhaps not the closest of friends.
Mm-hmm.
The first is Venezuela. And we have seen lots of investigations around former Venezuelan government officials. And it has to be with some amount of cooperation, even with the current Venezuelan government. I would also point to Mexico, because I've talked to numerous former DOJ officials who talked to me about the cooperation they received from Mexican officials, albeit difficultly and not well publicized by design, because the Mexican officials didn't want it publicized. Nevertheless, there was a joint interest in fighting corruption. So I think a lot more of that goes on than even we're aware in the public pronouncements we see when there's an FCPA enforcement action or other. And I guess maybe that led me to want to kind of explore with you the criticalness of basic due diligence and doing your due diligence up front. And don't simply, as you've said in prior podcasts, do a Google search. So I was wondering if kind of introduce the topic and get your thoughts on that.
In terms of cross-border collaboration, that's definitely the case. There's a lot more going on than what we see in the headlines. And I've seen that firsthand. My background with Homeland Security, I saw a lot of great partnership across law enforcement agencies all around the world. And so it's absolutely going on every day. Circling back to your question about the due diligence process, again, when you're looking at going into one of these other jurisdictions, the key is to really understand who you're doing business with. If you've got third-party agents or third-party vendors you're working with, you do need to hit the Google search. You need to have a basic understanding of what they look like. You need to do your basic checks in terms of hitting the databases, but you can't stop there. You really got to get an understanding of what's going on at the ground level. And that's something that we help our clients with. We take an open source intelligence-based approach to collecting information in to really map out what the risk profile of the companies and the individuals look like. But then we also take a boots on the ground approach overseas to really collect the intelligence necessary to understand how those third parties, in the example that we're talking through, are actually conducting business in those jurisdictions. The other thing that you've really got to get a handle on is the local cultural and business norms. So even besides the fact that you understand who you're doing business with, you need to understand how the local customs, the local business norms can impact your company policies and your company culture, because you may need to make some decisions in terms of making changes depending on what you see.
The due diligence on the local level. And one of the things that Infortal has made clear from a business perspective over the years is having a local resource to do in-country searches in a local language to understand the culture of the country when they're doing that. And that could be a public record search, it could be a courthouse search, it can be a media search. So I was wondering if you could give a few words on the critical nature of having an in-country resource do that type of search as opposed to a Tom Fox or other Anglo who might be going to a different country.
It's really critical to have that local knowledge and to have those contacts and really kind of talk through the risk issues that come about through the research. Because if you don't have that local knowledge and local understanding, you're really not going to be able to interpret what you find. And I'll give you a great example. We've had a few clients who have invested recently in the United Kingdom, and you would think, okay, that must be pretty straightforward. Couldn't think of a more similar country than the UK. But they have a very different legal system in the United Kingdom, and their sets of records, particularly in the bankruptcy space and related to business, are very different than what we have here. And so you really need that local understanding and that local knowledge to understand what you're actually seeing, and then be able to make decisions based upon what that information is showing you. The only way to do that, again, is with boots on the ground in the local area that has that understanding of the local business norms, cultures, and customs.
I am so glad you picked the United Kingdom as an example, because almost every American will think that is the country most close to us. Yet, as you correctly note, there's some very basic differences. And I'm going to add differences in the attorney-client privilege. And most importantly, if you're engaged in certain types of M&A, you get to look at 25 contracts. 25, not 25 million in value, not your top 25,
Right.
25. And if you're buying a multi-billion-dollar energy concern in the United Kingdom, frankly, the Department of Justice doesn't care what the UK rules are. They want an adequate due diligence and a plan to deal with that. And that's something the company has to come up with. It's not up to the government to tell us how to do it. So you're absolutely correct that you need to have that boots on the ground intelligence going forward. Chris, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I hope our listeners will join us for part 4, where we take up sanctions intelligence. Before we leave, if I could ask, if our listeners wanted more information, could you tell us the best way to go?
Absolutely. Best place to go is our website, and that is infortal.com. Thank you very much, Tom.